Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience and the Australian Red Cross for this webinar on Recovery Uncovered, Understanding the Community Dynamics, Grief and Mental Health Impacts After Disasters. My name's Erin Pelly. I'm the National Recovery Manager at Australian Red Cross. I'm so happy to have you all today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the various lands you're all joining from today and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in the event. If you could pop it in the chat, we'd love to see the diversity in lands and waterways of the people who are joining today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people's ongoing culture and connections to the lands, as well as their contributions in disaster recovery and for caring for country around Australia. Before we begin, I've got a couple of brief housekeeping notes. We will be talking about disasters today, and we know that talking about disasters can bring up some challenging feelings for people. So make sure you do something really nice for yourselves. Take some time out, get some fresh air. If you've got some sunshine, make sure to take some time out or call a mate. And if you're feeling like you might need a bit more support, there's the numbers for Lifeline and the website for Beyond Blue on the screen. I think someone's going to put it in the chat shortly. We are recording today's event and the recording will be available afterwards. We'll be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take any questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, not the chat. And you can upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'll do my best to ask these at the end of the presentations. Please use the chat window to share any thoughts and reflections during the presentations, but just a reminder to please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting our comments or questions today. This is the second webinar in the Recovery Uncovered series, presented by our disaster recovery mentors, which is hosted by ADA and Australian Red Cross. Disaster Recovery Mentors is a program coordinated by the Australian Red Cross, which aims to support disaster impacted communities, their leaders and people supporting them in their recovery. The aim of the program is to support community-led recovery in Australia. The webinar series, Recovery Uncovered, has been designed to provide recovery workers, practitioners and community members with insights into disaster recovery from a community perspective. Our mentors will share disaster recovery lessons from emergency management and the disaster recovery and resilience sector using a combination of lived experience and storytelling presented by our disaster recovery mentors. We had our first webinar last month, which was an introduction to community disaster recovery with Dr. Kate Brady and Anne Leadbeater, and provided an overview of disaster recovery from a community perspective. And they're on the ADA Knowledge Hub. In today's session, we've got disaster recovery mentor Kris Newton, who is going to talk through the intricate dynamics of communities and provide personal experiences and professional insights into local leadership in recovery. And then we've got psychologists Glassock and David Younger, who'll then explore the effects of grief and loss and the impacts on mental health and well-being on children, families and relationships. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for today. First, we've got Kris Newton, who's been the manager at the Mountains Community Resource Network since March 2012. In her role as manager, Kris convenes and supports a range of cross-sectoral agency networks. Following the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfires, Kris chaired the Wellbeing Recovery Subcommittee, and again after the 2019-2020 Black Summer fires, also then followed by floods and COVID. Since 2013, she's convened the Recovery and Resilience Preparedness Group, and is also a permanent observer representing the community sector on the Blue Mountains Local Emergency Management Committee. Then we've got Rose Glassock, who's a registered psychologist and qualified primary school teacher working in the New South Wales Department of Education for 30 years in Sydney and the Blue Mountains. Rose is a recipient of the Resilient New South Wales Award in recognition of the work she has done to support her school's psychosocial recovery after the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfires, and has developed a model for fostering post-traumatic growth in disaster recovery, utilising a positive psychology framework. Finally, we have David Younger, who's a Melbourne-based clinical psychologist, as well as a national disaster preparedness and recovery expert. David has almost 20 years' experience as a psychologist and has been a trusted advisor after numerous events, including bushfires, floods, droughts, cyclones, 2017 Burke Street tragedy, thunderstorm asthma, and COVID-19. I think someone's putting a comment on the speakers' bios. I'm really happy to have you all with me today. I've got lots of questions from last month's webinar, and I'd like to pass over to you, Kris, to kick us off.
Thanks, Erin. Really appreciate you inviting me to this event, because it's, I think, a very exciting webinar series coming up. So I wanted to set the scene a bit today for some of the more in-depth work that David and Rose are going to talk to you about. In particular, looking at the first 6 months and the first year. So what people don't always appreciate is that there's an immediate surge in need. Most people think of the obvious things like food and a roof over your head and some clothes to wear and so forth, and that's all absolutely spot on. Housing is a long-term need. Unfortunately, our current housing affordability situation makes it fairly grim for a lot of people. But after the surge of immediate and emergency relief, we need long-term supports with housing. Domestic and family violence, we know, and sexual assault goes up dramatically. Mental health issues, which David and Rose will talk about, including anxiety, depression, suicides, marital issues, divorce, and so on. Huge levels of financial distress, and particularly with our cost of living situation at the moment, food, clothing, utilities, school supplies, even just school excursions, alcohol and other drugs. So the point I need to make here is that in many jurisdictions, and New South Wales is certainly one of them, local community services are not funded to deal with this surge. We are struggling, frankly, with the levels of need in our community at the moment, and this puts an extra burden on local community services. So when I come to the section on community-led recovery, it's important to remember that often it's those local community services who are already overwhelmed dealing with the long-term recovery work. So then I wanted to talk a bit about the sort of impacts this has on both individuals and on the community. And a really good reference, which will go up in the chat, is Dr. Rob Gordon's webinar on the first 6 months, and indeed on the second year, and the impacts that this has on recovery. So trauma is a word that gets thrown around a bit. It can be variously interpreted, but it's often considered to be a wound or an injury or damage of some kind, which can have significant impacts on both physical and mental health. We all know the adrenal reaction, fight, flight, freeze, and adrenal depletion over the longer term is a really serious issue, which impacts both physical and mental health. And I need to emphasize that these impacts of trauma can happen whether you are directly impacted or not. So we know from the 10 Years Beyond Bushfires report that the people who were impacted by the Black Saturday fires in 2009 in Victoria are still having trauma impacts, some of them 10 years plus, and that seems to have very little to do with whether or not they were impacted directly, i.e. lost or had significant damage to their house, for example. So some of the physical impacts can be things like trouble sleeping, muscle tension, exacerbation of any pre-existing conditions, and they can be physical conditions like arthritis or asthma, not just re-triggering of pre-existing trauma. Headaches, nausea, feeling restless, finding it very hard to concentrate or problem solve. Or emotional impacts could be issues like anger. And here we often notice a gender difference. This is a gross generalization, but I like to say in our society, men are often socialized to not feel sad, they feel mad. And women are often socialized to not get mad, feel sad. So anxiety, depression, and so forth. So sadness, fear, helplessness, guilt. We often get survivor guilt. So even though your house might not have been impacted, if all of your neighbours' houses were swept away or burnt, and you're the only one remaining, not only have you lost your community, which is significant impact on your connections and feeling of belonging, but also you can feel guilty for being the ones who didn't get impacted directly. After a few weeks, though, when we settle a little and have some space to think about the issues, loss and grief will often come up, and Dave is going to elaborate on this in the next segment. We notice the disruption to our normal daily routines. So in the first few weeks, it's often just survival, like getting a roof over our head, having clothes to wear, getting some money to buy food, those sorts of things. How are we going to get the kids back to school? But longer term, it's the disruption to what we consider our normal routines, the things that we take so for granted that we, like breathing, pay no attention to them. Or as Dr. Rob Gordon talks about, our assumptions and expectations about life. And it can often take years, 1 to 3 years, and for long-term recovery, as I've said, 10 years plus, to sort all those disruptions to our daily routine out, or to create a new set of routines and assumptions. And this can lead to constant levels of anxiety and loss, and a loss of our sense of safety, because we assumed things about life or had expectations about life that have been severely disrupted, basically. So for the first 12 months at least, impacted people often get overwhelmed by the level of busyness. We talk about disaster brain, brain fog, exhaustion, and this is linked to that adrenaline mode and the fight impulse. But it can also lead to tunnel vision, the sort of what's in it for me. It can lead to poor decision making. People can be self-centered, that what's in it for me. They can be impatient, intolerant. Their logical left-hand side of the brain can shut down a bit, and we can rely on the right-hand side of the brain, which can be very creative, but is also very emotional. And we often get deep fatigue, and that can go on for years, but it's very often in the first 12 months after the disaster hits. Unfortunately, this is also the time when we start to need to think strategically to deal with the issues that face us, and that's impacting on things like our absorption of information and the ability to deal with complexity, even to just fill out a simple form. But we lack the capacity to do that. And there's some really good Red Cross work on Communicating in Recovery, some training that's available for those of you who want to know more. This will also go in the chat. Want to know more about how this actually impacts on what we say. And in effect, it might mean that you need to repeat the same message 100 times, 1,000 times, until such point in time when the community is actually ready to hear that. And that will vary from individual to individual. The stress reaction also tends to shut down our connection with ourselves and our feelings, and we can get a distorted sense of time. Anybody who's been impacted by COVID lockdowns will probably be able to relate to this. Many people talk about the concertina effect of COVID, that it stretched time out, but also we have to add 3 years to everything in terms of our memory of when things took place. So it does take a long time to acclimatise to the new normality. Rob's webinars on the second year are really helpful here. Again, references in the chat. He talks about a decompression reaction, like divers coming up from a deep dive need to stop at various points in the ascent in order to not get the decompression reaction, but also we start to feel again. And while that's really great, and we feel less numb, it also means that we can feel worse because we're starting to reconnect with our feelings. The other thing that happens in community more broadly is that most of you who are working in recovery will know about the honeymoon period, where we're all grateful to the emergency services and our neighbours who might have helped us save our lives or connected with us. So there's an initial community cohesion. But once people start to settle, and this could be, around about 2 or 3 months down the track, sometimes not even that long, we often get fracturing or polarization of communities or families. They can be along pre-existing fault lines, everything from neighborhood feuds to different perspectives from a business perspective, for example, or a community connections perspective, or they can be fractures, new ones created by the disaster. Often, how come they got money and we didn't, or how come that community project got funded and ours didn't. And once the exhaustion, disruption, disillusionment phases kick in, there can often be a lack of support from community. People who came together to form committees or form community recovery groups can often fall apart at that point where they're looking for people to step up. But the people who might step up are equally exhausted. So it can create issues. So Rob talks about managing the adrenaline state, managing family and social relationships, get a communal perspective. For example, getting together, telling our stories, reconnecting with our community, with our neighbours. At a family and personal level, it's things like returning fun and pleasure or leisure or hobbies or recreational activities to life. People often feel guilty about going away for a family holiday down the coast, for example, for a long weekend, but it's absolutely essential to return purpose and pleasure to life. Aiming for a sense of achievement at the projects that we had, that might be rebuilding your house or finally getting the roof back on the home or whatever it might be. And Anne Leadbeater talks, I think, quite rightly about aiming for a life we value. Rose mentions post-traumatic growth in the 6 to 12 month period, and that's basically what we're after. It will not be the normal that we had. It will be a new normal. but it must be a life that we value in order to counter the impacts of the trauma that we've all been through. So the second thing I wanted to talk quickly about was, what does community-led look like in practice? And here I want to talk about centering the voices of community members, both as first responders and in the longer term recovery. It's often my experience that community members are seen as people in deficit. Something bad has happened to them. Whereas in fact, what we need to be doing is flipping that coin and looking at community-led members as leaders and actors in their own community. They are in fact the experts in their own lives, and they're the experts in their own communities. So we need to look at how we can enhance their sense of agency and self-determination. They already have it. They're just feeling a little bit lost at the moment. But after every disaster, we see local leadership, and whether that's people getting out in their canoes to save their neighbours off the roofs, or whether it's existing local leadership, either formal or informal, and it's the informal that we need to look out for. The formal ones tend to be the squeaky wheels anyway, but it's the emergent leadership in terms of identifying the needs and imperatives for their own local community that are the people we need to get hold of. What is the role in recovery of community members? Just that. We need to listen to them, to centre them and their voices as members of community. It's often the squeaky wheels who get the most attention, but we need to remember that there are discriminatory practices, unintentional often, that impact. So gender is one, disability is another, age is another. We need to make sure that we listen to all the voices, and I'm sure Rose will talk about the voices of children and young people, which are often excised. We allow adults to speak on their behalf. So figuring out who is in the community and how we can hear their voices. The other issue I want to raise is the local place-based community services. They are the ones who deal with the most at risk and most vulnerable members of your local community, and they will know how to find them. If you're looking to hear the voices of women, people with disability, local elders, Aboriginal community members, Indigenous community members more broadly, those are the places to go, along with certainly in metropolitan areas or adjacent metropolitan areas, local councils may well be of help. In regional and remote areas, possibly not so much.
Kris,
So,
I had a question as
yes, go ahead.
About, like, you're talking about what's happening in communities is really hard. There's tunnel vision, there's a bit of self-interest, there's fracturing, there's discriminatory practices. I'm wondering then, one of the questions that came up in the last webinar was really about this theme on trust.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about your experience with that and how you can build trust with communities and all parts of the community.
Sure. It takes a long time. I can't reiterate that enough. It is not enough for a local recovery officer, a member of council, a member of a recovery team from a state jurisdiction. It is not enough for them to turn up and say, you know, we're here from government and we're here to help you. We need introduction from local community services and people who do have trust within the local community. And we also need people to listen. Local residents are experts in their own lives and their own community. Listen up, basically. You will build trust if you don't go and tell them what you're about to do to them, but listen to their needs, the trends. It doesn't need to be complicated. You don't need to do a formal needs analysis with 33%. Just look, ask, look for trends. There are micro neighbourhoods that you need to pay attention to, and non-geographical communities like LGBTIQ, Indigenous, and so on. But the important thing here is to Jenny Brown, a community development worker in northern New South Wales, I think, put it brilliantly the other day. She said, we have to work at the speed of trust. Now, in Indigenous communities, that will take years. It will probably take years in terms of other local communities too. But if we can use the local community services who have built up trust, or local council where that exists, trust, we can use their warm referrals into communities and accompany them into the community. Does that answer the question, do you think?
Fabulous. I've got time for one more, Kris.
Okay.
Unless you've got something else really burning one point you wanted to make. I think this is one as well that came up last time that I'm desperate to ask you, but I love that idea of working at the speed of trust. Often in recovery, conflicting wants and needs become really tricky for people working with communities. How do you think people working with disaster impacted communities can provide tailored guidance to enable recovery? Why is it important? And how do you best navigate differing needs, wants, and as well as managing community expectations?
Sure. I think there are some good models, Erin, and we can learn from past disasters and other communities who've been through this. Many people will know about the People's Republic of Malakuta. Madra did an amazing job of, I can't remember how many priorities they finally identified as part of their community. It was a very fractured community for a whole range of reasons historically, but they managed to get everyone to come together to identify what the community's needs were and to prioritise them based on a consensus within the local community. And I think that's a really good model. We're using something similar with our resilient villages here in the Blue Mountains. But there's Resilient Lismore, there's the Strathewen example. We have examples from other communities who've done this work. I'm not saying it's easy work, but if I have an idea and I'm passionate about it, but everyone else in my community puts it as a very low priority, then I have to accept that that's a consensus within my community rather than be told, don't do that, or that's not of value. It just didn't get as many votes, for example.
I love that. Yeah. Listen and acknowledge and communicate openly, I guess.
There's one other really important thing I wanted to raise, and there are references in the chat, and that's the critical importance of social connection. Rebuilding social ties within the local community is absolutely essential to this work. So if you're doing that level of work, please go and have a look at some of the references. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks so much. I might throw to David now, and thanks so much, Kris. I've got a bunch more questions I want to ask you at the end during the Q&A. So I'll throw to David, who's going to talk about the mental health and wellbeing impacts of disaster.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thank you to everyone out there that's joined this webinar in showing your interest to support our Australian communities, both in the present and into the future. And thanks also, Kris, for a wonderful presentation and overview. So everybody out there, I've got 3 key talking points, and I'm just going to mention that I have predominantly an adult focus in working my way through these talking points, but Rose, who's going to follow me, is going to focus more on children and young people, I believe. So my first talking point will be an overview of core mental health impacts, and I'm going to throw some statistics at you in a way, some figures. And then my second talking point will be a little bit less formal, and I want to just move ever so gently and gradually into considering some additional very important issues of relevance whenever you're working with and supporting a disaster-affected community. And then thirdly, I'll bring us through to important priorities for providing support and assistance, whether you're currently doing that at the moment or perhaps considering that that might be something that occurs for you in the not too distant future. So in 2023, there was a very large-scale meta-analytic study, which essentially is a study that takes a whole series of independent studies and then distills the results or combines the results. There was nearly 45,000 people in the sample, so quite considerable, and the sample was drawn from Asia, Europe, and America. The main mental health issues or diagnoses that were identified were, as you can see here, generalized anxiety, depression, substance use, an adjustment disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And I felt this was important to mention because these are, in essence, the 5 most common mental health diagnoses that tend to come out of a disaster experience, whether that is taken from a sample in Asia, Europe, and America, or Australia, but I'll bring things through and make them a little bit more locally relevant in a moment. So other findings that came through from this particular study were that disasters were linked with poorer mental health outcomes, unfortunately, but no surprises there. And that the trauma and stress-related condition, PTSD, was associated with such things as higher exposure to disaster, having a past history of prior trauma, aging, as well as property damage. And then a lower socioeconomic status was linked to persisting psychological difficulties, so lasting for a longer period of time. And then relocation and disruption to life, and disruption was just mentioned in the previous presentation by Kris, of vital services was associated with psychological morbidity, which means more than one mental health issue or diagnosis. Just trying to get my slides to work here, everybody. There we go. Okay, I think things are working now. And then I wanted to bring you, through to something a little bit closer to home. And although with a much smaller sample, still of relevance, last year the Climate Council of Australia conducted a survey, and they found that of 80% of those people that responded to the survey, 80% of people who responded to the survey said that they had experienced at least once a heat wave, or a flood, or bushfire, or drought, or a cyclone, or a storm, or landslide. And that's quite a significant percentage. And then half of those surveyed said that their mental health had been detrimentally affected, so 50%. And then 20% reported a major or moderate mental health impact. So I think these are all quite significant figures. The most prevalent mental health issues were, and here we are again, anxiety, depression, or PTSD. And over 30% of people or community members said or made the comment that there wasn't enough mental health support available. Maybe I might just ask for Charlotte, maybe you could change the slides for me. I seem to have some sort of big delay occurring here. Would that be all right?
We can see the Black Saturday.
Yeah, that's where I'm up to. So if it's all right, I might just sort of say next slide, and then hopefully things will just flow through. I've got something happening at my end. So let's just recap briefly. That very big meta-analytic study with 45,000 people, and then the Climate Council of Australia in a survey last year. And then I just wanted to bring you through even closer to home and with some specific disasters. Firstly, the Victorian Black Saturday fires going back to 2009. And these findings here come from the Beyond Bushfires series of studies that took place. And I believe I took this from the 10-year anniversary final report that came out. So there were findings such as this, and I wanted to bring this through to sort of highlight the length of time that disaster impacts can occur for. Firstly, during the 3rd and 4th years, violence against women was 7 times higher than the national average, and therefore in non-disaster or non-fire affected communities. Life satisfaction decreased during years 3 to 5, but improved after 10. Anger was a predominant issue in high impact communities. And then at 10 years, 22% of community had mental health symptoms, usually depression and anxiety or anxiety. And mental health risk factors included income, property loss, and relationships. And then if we move from fire to flood, and in particular, some of the New South Wales floods that took place in 2017, for those people that experienced high-level disruption in this particular study, 10 to 33% of them reported experiencing mental health distress. Direct disruption was associated with a mental health issue, again, depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, and informal social connectedness and belonging were really important factors. We've just heard Kris touch on the importance of social connection and rebuilding relationships, and I'll come back through to this in my 3rd talking point. And in fact, social connection was related to a decreased risk of a mental health issue. Next slide. Thank you. And then what I wanted to point out or mention, there's a few important points here, sort of having hit you, I guess, in a way with some mental health statistics and facts. The first is to say that overwhelmingly the literature tells us that the majority of people recover from a disaster experience, and that is certainly true. That's based on approximately figures relating to 20% of people who experience a disaster developing a mental health issue and 80% not developing a mental health issue, but I want to unpack this a little bit more in a moment. Secondly, that symptoms tend to be more severe during the first 12 months and then settle, but there are caveats to this, hence the diagram to the right here, which I'll talk about in a moment. And again, most survivors recover and don't experience long-term mental illness. Children and young people are absolutely and definitely resilient, but they're also at risk, and Rose will come through to talk about children and young people. I really feel this has changed more recently, or is changing over the last few years, but the tendency less recently was for children, regrettably, and young people to be sort of left out a bit or quite significantly in the disaster recovery as well as preparedness space. And then my 4th point here, though, and this is one of the important ones I wanted to bring through, is that it's not as simple as the first 12 months involves a lot of distress and then things settle, or most people recover and don't develop a mental health issue, because whilst those points are really important, there's so much variation from community to community, from disaster to disaster, from individual to individual. And then what the research does tell us is that in terms of exposure to traumatic events, trajectories of recovery do change over time. And that's what this diagram to the right is showing. It's showing 5 well-identified trajectories of recovery, one being the chronic pathway, which is, for example, unfortunately, a community member that develops PTSD and then does not get better. Secondly, a resilient pathway there, affected to a point, but then recovering from that or bouncing back using the old language. Thirdly, a delayed response, where a community member experiences a significant disaster containing trauma, seems to then be traveling okay for a period of time, but then experiences a negative deterioration in their health and functioning. And then you can see there's a resistant pathway and then a post-traumatic growth pathway. And again, I want to bring these through because disaster recovery is long-term, at an absolute minimum, some years, potentially 5 to 7 on average, and quite possibly beyond that for some communities. And then let's also not forget that the situation in this country and other places around the world has changed significantly over the last couple of years, well, 4.5 years, where we seem to have moved into an era of cascading disasters. And whilst there is not a lot of literature at the moment, or studies that tell us what the impacts and the effects of cascading disasters are on mental health, there are some. Melbourne Uni was involved in a scoping review just last year, and the initial indications that came from those results were regrettably of a worsening of mental health as a result of or associated with exposure to cascading disasters, so more than one. So we can't assume that being exposed to more than one disaster is going to have the same impact and effect as a single incident event. Next slide, please. And then I thought it would perhaps just be also helpful and important to drop in here the effects of terrorism versus disasters, where typically, and I guess very broadly, I could say the effects are worse and more significant based on what the literature tells us. Terrorism, a very brief definition, is of violent criminal acts by individuals or groups, especially against civilians for political aims. Overwhelmingly, the impacts and the effects are more severe, complex, and long-term. And I've just included some additional figures or statistics here to show that. So, for example, PTSD in about 30% of survivors with direct exposure. And then I've made mention here of the Oklahoma City bombing and then 9/11. Next slide, please. But what I want to bring you through to is to consider some more important, bring through to you some additional important considerations. I made the comment 2 slides ago that it's sort of not as simple as a mental health diagnosis or not, or the first year where symptoms are most significant and then they begin to settle, or the 80% versus 20% of people that I touched on. And then I wanted to link with that when we look at disaster preparedness and also recovery through the mental health lens, what we're tending to do is to focus on the individual. But what I really want to bring into this picture, and Kris was talking about this in a really lovely way, is the important role that community has. And in fact, if I just expand on that a little bit and say that there is this all-important social dimension that disasters take place in, and that is impacted and affected, and that we are all, if you're supporting and assisting community, working in and existing in. It's definitely not just a case of is a person depressed or not, and then let's treat them or provide the necessary support and assistance to alleviate symptoms with the aim of achieving recovery. For most people, there's the significant social dimension within which their life exists. And if we had a little bit more time here, we could talk about different phases and stages of social process and recovery. So I just very briefly make 2 points to you, or 2 comments about these different stages. And one is that typically there is the event or the disaster that takes place, of course. Then there is, following that, the positive fusive state. Community members come together, they do what needs to be done. They don't sit around and wait for authorities or emergency services to appear. That state can be maintained for a reasonable period of time, but eventually it will start to diminish and break down. And this is where cleavage planes or points of difference amongst community members, amongst groups, can start to appear. And they can put at risk successful community recovery. Therefore, what we're looking for is a transition into coordinated differentiation and community-led recovery also, what Kris spoke about. Or if I was to share with you another perspective of stages and phases that sits alongside that one, we could talk about the survival response, resistance-related stress, or the cortisol state of stress, which can easily last for 18 months to 3 years, 6 months to 3 years, followed by a 3rd stage of recovery from recovery, followed by a 4th stage potentially of who am I? What is my life about? A reevaluation of life priorities, which then, if recovery is truly successful, contributes to a recreation of a meaningful life that assists and supports a person to live in the present once again and to look to the future. But then if I come through to my three other points here, for anybody out there that is supporting communities currently or has not yet had that experience but will be doing it in the future, I wanted to make these suggestions to you that you always work to develop a good understanding of the history of the community that you're working with in as much detail as is possible. Even if you go back 50 years or 100 years, you might be surprised at just how much rich history there is of relevance to the way community members are responding following a disaster. You might also be surprised and notice some of the past unresolved issues that come back through as well. I also wanted to mention that it's important to get a really good understanding of the unique features of the disaster that took place. A fast-moving intense fire, for example, versus a slow-moving fire for which community had a lot of time to prepare and evacuate. And there are many other nuanced details, but if you can sort of get a reasonable understanding of them, then they will also bring clarity and context to what that particular community is experiencing at that point in time, which then connects ever so importantly with the establishing meaningful relationships based upon understanding, authenticity, and trust. And then I just wanted to mention to you another phrase here, degraded quality of life, which comes from Rob Gordon's work of a long period of time and over the years. And this is a reference to, say, the 80% of people, or some of the 80% of community members who don't develop a formal mental health diagnosis, but life is still not great. It's not necessarily full of happiness and joy, often because there is this really significant disrupted life involving long-term recovery that sort of comes into play. Next slide, please. And then again, if we had more time, I would unpack this in more detail with you. But if we put mental health diagnoses to the side, what I wanted to do was just touch on three main effects of disasters ever so briefly, some of which Kris mentioned as well. So stress, disruption to life, and loss. And I'll keep this brief and say to you that in terms of stress, we can think about two main stress states, although in actual fact there are four. But the two stress states that I want to refer to here are the adrenaline-based survival mode of functioning, which is a state of functioning that we're supposed to go into, that we need to go into when we're faced with significant threat. And it's a state of functioning that enables us to increase the chance of survival and to do what needs to be done in a high-pressure, very threatening situation. In an ideal world, once the threat has diminished or has gone and a person has survived, we will be able to, as humans, return to a state of healthy, balanced functioning, known as homeostasis. But in a disaster-related environment or in a disaster environment, that's not always or often not possible, because there is the disrupted life that follows. We could say there are the events of the day or the weeks, and then there is the everything else afterwards part. And this brings us through to the resistance state of stress, the second state, which we talk about as being predominantly fueled or driven by cortisol, which is a stress hormone that gives us access to energy we wouldn't otherwise or normally get access to. In a way, both of these stress states are highly adaptive and assist us to do what needs to be done. But any stress that is too intense and or lasts for too long can have health and well-being impacts further down the track and ultimately contribute to the fourth stage of exhaustion. And I think we used to say something like in the third or fourth years, we would often see a disaster-affected community and community members hitting the point of exhaustion. But it's happening a lot sooner these days because of the effect of cascading disasters and everything that has taken place. Then there's the disruption to life, and perhaps if I just say pre-disaster, most people have a normal life in inverted commas, and normal life is something that's comprised of constancies, and constancies are those things that we take for granted, that we don't give conscious thought to, because they're just always there. But whenever as humans, and this occurs outside of a disaster-related environment as well, but whenever we're faced with trauma and adversity, usually there is at a minimum disruption to constancies. Things change. If your home has burned down, you'll have to go and live somewhere else and work your way through a rebuild process, potentially, which will take a long period of time. And that will disrupt the pre-existing habits and routines that bound life together previously, that provided a stable, constant foundation for living. At a minimum, disruption causes stress. In fact, it's a key driver of the resistance stage, cortisol, endurance, as I just touched on a moment ago. But it also does really inhibit personal recovery or beginning the personal recovery journey, in part because our attention and our focus is elsewhere, never mind the myriad of ways in which the high stress state affects our functioning psychologically, emotionally, and physically. And then thirdly, there is loss, many and varied. I tend to mention to people that work in the disaster space, but also to community members, there seems to be a standard assessment that's performed after a disaster by those that's affected, and that is of measuring or assessing the amount of loss on the basis of financial or material impact. And what that often looks like or sounds like is a community member who says, the flood wasn't really that bad for us, it didn't come into our house, but Mary and Joe down the road, they were completely inundated. Or somebody who isn't a business owner, for example, drawing a comparison with somebody that is. But what I think is important to bring into this is the emotional aspect, of course, because for us as humans, to use that phrase, anything that we have developed a connection or an attachment to and that we've bonded with over time, when that connection is threatened or disrupted or broken, there is an impact and effect. There's an emotional impact and effect. We are emotional beings, as well as physical and psychological. And so loss is many and varied. Loss of the beautiful natural landscape, loss relating to my neighbours who've moved away, loss of the refreshing conversations that I had with someone down at the store on the main street, every Saturday when I collected my paper or went and bought the milk, and a myriad of other things. So it's important we never make assumptions about the type of loss that people are experiencing, because we never really know unless they choose to share with us what their personal experience is. Next slide, please. And then just sort of extending a little bit more, I think it's also important to touch on 3 other responses that come up relatively frequently, being survivor guilt, solastalgia, and relationship difficulties. And we were often, I think, asked the question about survivor guilt and what that is. Is it normal? Where does it come from? And a stereotypical example would be of the person whose home is not burned down or flooded, but of their beloved neighbour who does have that really unfortunate experience. And the questions that come through about, why I feel this deep sense of guilt. Part of my response or reply to that is that guilt is an emotion that we associate with the perception of having done something wrong. So if I go and do the shopping at Coles and then walk out of the shopping centre with my shopping bags, load everything into the car, drive home, get home, open the boot, I'm unloading, and then I suddenly realise I didn't pay, of course I'm going to have this sort of wave of stress flow through me, and then feel a bit guilty, and then think I've got to go back and pay. Of course, a disaster environment is totally different, and this is just a simple example, but what I wanted to bring it through to is that people who are experiencing survivor guilt have not done anything wrong. But or I could say, and therefore, the essence of that emotional response or reaction is, again, connection or attachment and an awareness of other, my empathy, my compassion, my sense of knowing what someone else is experiencing, and I feel bad for them. But I also feel bad and guilty in myself because in comparison, I'm not having to go through what they're going through. And so I think it's important that we normalize this response and reaction, but also that we help people understand it's a reaction that they're experiencing because they care for others and care for people in their community. Solastalgia is something I came across a few years ago when it became apparent that the cascading impact of disasters. Actually, it was after the Black Summer fires, 2019-20, was having a really profound impact and effect on community members. And this was a term coined in the 1990s, I believe, maybe early 2000s, to describe the deep distress, emotional or existential, experienced when disasters impact the natural environment, or in fact, when there are non-disaster impacts. And I found it's also important, helpful to put a name on this response and reaction as well for community members. And then just lastly, I wanted to ever so briefly touch on relationship difficulties, which are not a mental health disorder or diagnosis, but they absolutely occur, and they're in many ways related to the different trajectories or pathways of recovery that people walk down after a disaster. And there's probably a lot we could talk about here, but to try to keep it simple and sort of straight through to the point, a really important suggestion to mention to community members is that of re-establishing routines, re-establishing habits, minimizing disruption as early as is possible after a disaster, and re-evaluating priorities, and then making room and space for the most important priorities. For example, relationships, to spend time with my partner, to have conversations with my children, to check in on my parents. The disrupted post-disaster environment can absolutely sort of overrun all of that. And what we have seen occur many times over is that it can be 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the track before the disruption settles and before community members commence the personal recovery journey. And by then, relationships have been being neglected for a long period of time. Often it's too late. Next slide, please. And then lastly, for this talking point, before I move on to the last talking point, important groups to keep in consideration and quite possibly to seek more information about. Indigenous peoples who are at increased impact of disasters. ADAR has a community inclusive recovery module that you might be interested in. Secondly, children and young people, and I made the comment, they are definitely resilient, and adults can inadvertently make them vulnerable, but they also are at risk. It's very clear in the literature, and they can develop both short-term, medium-term, and long-term mental health symptoms. If my memory serves me correctly, the Beyond Bushfires Melbourne University studies found that those children who were in about grade prep, I think, when the 2009 fires occurred, their academic performance was impacted and affected significantly into the long term, and they were below the level of non-disaster affected peers right through their school education. Thirdly, the elderly, and then fourthly, people with a disability. Again, if I can just say, really important that we turn our minds to being inclusive and supporting these groups who are identified to be more at risk. And next slide, please. Just moving on to my final talking point, mental health and psychosocial support priorities. So again, we could talk in immense depth and for a long time about this, but I wanted to just bring through to you 5 main points, actually. The first one being that there is this evidence-informed, for those of you that are not aware, what we refer to as the stepped or matched care approach, which has 3 levels. And the 3 levels are based on research, as well as a hierarchical mental health intervention delivery that's based on need. And it goes essentially like this, that level 1 relates to the support and assistance that's provided in the early aftermath of a disaster. For example, PFA, psychological first aid, where we know again that the majority of people will recover, but what they need is support and assistance, the provision of information that will help to stabilize and normalize experience, and the opportunity to regain a sense of control and efficacy. And something like PFA will assist in doing that. Level 2, though, is for those people experiencing persisting or what are beginning to become persisting mental health and emotional impacts or effects at perhaps a month or 2 or 3 down the track. And then something like SOLAR, which is a manualized based program to provide psychosocial support and assistance to people has been developed. That's an Australian-based model and approach, the work of Phoenix. And then thirdly, the application of formal mental health interventions for people who have not gotten better or recovered. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to bring you through to those. So that's the bigger picture, evidence-informed approach. But more practically speaking, when you're working with community or you first start to work with a community, let's just really remember that relationships are the essence of everything that we do. And without having formed a trusted relationship, we're not going to be able to provide support and assistance. So you can think of as a relationship as an entry point to the recovery system, or that you are an entry point to the recovery system, founded on trust, authenticity, empathy, etc. Consistency over time is just so important to build that trust, was a question that came through in Kris's presentation. Also, use simple, easy to understand, non-complex words. Don't assume understanding, make allowances, check for understanding, and provide information in concise and non-complex ways. The disaster-affected brain and the stressed brain just does not have the capacity to understand and absorb information in the way that it is able to, or the way we're able to when we're not in a high state of stress. Next slide, please, and I'm almost there. And then I wanted to again come back big picture to just touch on the broader recovery system, or the psychosocial recovery system, and to suggest to you, or to mention that characteristics of good recovery-based services are these: that they're informal and close to community, they're proactive and initiating, as well as flexible and integrated with other services, they're networked and overlapping boundaries, there's a minimum of policy, procedure, and red tape. I should say there's also not a ticker box type approach. Community members feel that and sense that a mile off. It's based on personal relationships, and then ideally ownership by the community. Again, community-led recovery. And then next slide, please. And then ever so briefly, social capital. I'm running out of time here, I know, and Kris touched on social capital, but it's an absolute priority. Strengthening social capital or connections over grey infrastructure, which is the material and physical recovery. There are, in fact, different types of social connections that are important: bonding ties, bridging ties, and linking ties. And if you would like more information about this, it would be helpful to look up Professor Daniel Aldrich and read some of his work, or watch some of his freely available YouTube clips from the net. But in order to build social connections, communities must have social infrastructure, which means they do need to have meeting places, club rooms, a neighbourhood house, a community hub. It's very clear in the literature that more connected communities recover more quickly and effectively. They also respond better to disasters. And then to throw this in there, again, coming out of the Black Saturday fires in Victoria, being involved in 1 to 2 community organisations contributed to better mental health. And final slide, please. That was the final slide. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. Can't wait to have a bit more of a chat about working at the speed of trust, the need for ensuring that we are, connecting communities, ensuring community-led recovery, and making sure that we're helping communities help each other and look out for their loved ones and mates. Thank you.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll throw to Rose, who's going to talk more in depth about how we care for children and young people and the impacts of disasters on them. So thanks, David, and welcome, Rose.
Thanks, Erin. I am aware about the time, and a few of my slides will overlap with David, so I'm going to try and be concise. I'm joining you all from Durragland in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. So again, thanks everyone for putting this time aside and giving me the opportunity to talk about how young people and children are impacted by disaster. And thanks to Kris and David for that lead-in. So I'm trying to cover 5 topics, I guess, under this banner today. So just thinking about what do disasters look like through the eyes of a child, some of the typical responses you might see, what increases their vulnerability, the tiered responses, so echoing that model that David's just showed, but thinking about what does that look like for children and young people, and then some tips for parents. And both the typical responses and the tips for parents are also going to be provided to you in handouts, so via the website. So please don't try and think you've got to scribe things down, or if I speak a bit fast that you're missing anything. And I'm now going to check that I've got control. Yes, I have. Okay. So for children and young people, and I'm going to just do a little disclaimer, as Erin said in the introduction, I've worked in the schools in New South Wales for a very long time. So I'm probably going to abbreviate saying children and young people just to students. So we're really thinking about that sort of 4 and 5-year-olds right through to 18-year-olds. And naturally, they are presenting with distress following a disaster. But for most of our students, children and young people, they do recover with from the negative impacts of the disaster without professional help. So without the help of a psychologist like David and I. And that doesn't mean, that level of resilience doesn't mean they're not unaware or unaffected, but it just means that within the supportive environment of their family and friends and the school setting, that they can recover and thrive and survive. And so when we're thinking about the experience of these disasters for children and young people, we do use this terminology of a potentially traumatic event. And I'm sure this is not new to you, this terminology, but just again, really thinking about the disaster or serious incident may have happened, but what is it that that disaster looks like, feels like, sounds like through the eyes of a student, and even the difference within a family. And so that's sometimes the tension that we're navigating, that we have some of the family who are very impacted because it has been a traumatic event for them. And for other people in the family, it may be still, it had potential or maybe still does have potential to be a traumatic event. So, you know, an example of this is we were running a parent information session for supporting their children after a bushfire incident in the Blue Mountains, and a parent sort of very reluctantly and hesitantly came and asked us for support for his daughter. And he started with, you know, almost an apology of, I don't live in this area. Our house is fine. We haven't been impacted by the fire at all. And yet my daughter seems to be showing some of those typical reactions you've just mentioned. I don't understand. And that's because she was actually in a lockdown in the school setting. She had actually left school and then returned back to school and was a part of the lockdown. And so her experience of that same disaster was very different to the rest of her family. So again, just keeping in mind, what does it look like through the eyes of the children and young people? So here's some things, just some dot points for you to think about, is the loss and destruction to homes. I guess that's a fairly obvious one, but sometimes we don't think about, what about the loss and destruction of the school setting? Is it that a classroom has been damaged, whether that's by flood or fire or other disaster? All of their books gone. We have situations with senior students where it could be their major works and major projects that have been damaged. If shops are damaged and things are closed, does that mean that their part-time casual work is now finished? And so their ability to earn some income and maybe be a little bit more independent has changed. The caregiver response, so if their caregiver is displaced or injured, excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of water. Sorry about that. If their caregiver or friend is feeling overwhelmed and distressed, we really know that there's a lot of impact for children particularly, but children and young people, depending on how their caregiver or parent is responding. because of this aspect of, are they able to be that source of comfort and safety and support? Are they, suffering some of their own reactions, and therefore they're just not as available or accessible to their children? The interruptions to routine and stability, I think that you've had that echoed now by the three of us, finding it hard to feel safe and finding it hard to regulate their feelings and behaviour. So again, just to sort of summarise that information just as another brief slide. So adults might be thinking, well, what was the threat, to me or my family? Was there a threat to life for us? For children, it may be the separation from parents, and it may be that they didn't know where their parents were. And again, depending if they were maybe at preschool or at school at the time, and they're unsure of, are their parents safe? An injury, obviously for adults, but an injury to self for children, a loss of property versus the injury or loss of a parent is a high concern to children. Adults might be thinking of their livelihood, their jobs, their businesses, and children might be thinking about the loss of their pet or their favourite things, or sometimes it's their pastimes that it may not be the family priority to purchase a new PlayStation for the adolescent that has been destroyed in the disaster, but actually that's how they connected with their friends. That was a fun pastime for them. And so again, it's like how much of their lifestyle generally has been impacted. And then as we've discussed, and Kris and David have both mentioned, that loss of community for the adult and how that often echoes for children is that disruption to the routine and disruption to the typical activities that they are usually doing. So I guess I put this little question there, and I realised that with a question like, what were you thinking? It certainly needs the right tone of voice. So it's not, what were you thinking? It's certainly what I'm trying to encourage you with this is, it's what were you thinking? So if we're working with a young person or an adolescent, it's about, let me have some understanding. So we're having that air of curiosity for them to go, but what were you thinking during the time of this disaster, and what are you thinking now? Oops, sorry. Oh. Okay. So I mentioned some typical reactions. I've just grouped them into 4 headings. So the physical reactions, which you can see, they might seem a bit vague: eating more or eating less, sleeping more or sleeping less. The emotional reactions and that sort of flat affect. Often when I'm talking with children and young people, I just call it blah. It's just this sort of like, I'm not really particularly, sad or angry, but I'm not really excited or, much looking forward to the things that I used to look forward to. So it's just this sort of meh or blah feeling. The changes in thinking, and certainly Kris and David have both already used the word brain fog. It certainly impacts on our young people as well. And then some of those behavioural reactions about being irritable and perhaps withdrawing from both people and activities that they used to be involved with, or just avoidance. So these are the things that, just as 4 general headings that we sort of alert people to think about. Just monitor those. They're really typical reactions. And then I'm going to really sort of highlight these quickly, because you will get these in your handout as well. But just to break it down, the next 3 slides, looking at what is there any difference at different age groups? So the lower primary age group, this is looking at 5 to 8-year-olds, and then we've got the upper primary 8 to 12 and adolescents 12 to 18. And some of the things you might, I'll just quickly note here, is under relational, it might be that unwillingness to be left alone. So what we might see is an increase in that separation anxiety, not wanting to go to preschool or to school, or to be left at grandma's, or to be left when the parents need to return to work. So for some parents, if you again look at the bottom one on that relational, wanting to sleep with parents at night, so there can be quite regressive behaviour in these little people, and so that can cause some frustration for parents, like, we've already done this, they're already sleeping in their own bed, they weren't wetting the bed, and now that seems to be happening again. So again, that's in that sort of typical reaction for this age group. And for these little people, that's somatic complaints. So if you look at the column under physical, and that can be, you know, I'm sure you can imagine to think of a 5 or 6 year old saying, I've got a tummy ache. And the tummy ache might mean that they're, you know, not wanting to go to school, or they just have a little bit of a headache, or they just don't feel right. And again, as I said, that sort of both the developmental regression, but also sometimes cognitively and in terms of their language, that we may see a bit of regression in those skills as well. So for our upper primary kids, you can probably predict there's a bit of a trajectory here. So with the emotional response, it may be that starting to be some school refusal. In our relational column, it might be you know, just really a bit curious about what the adults are doing, how the adults are responding, what's going on. And just for the adults, whether that's school staff or parents, just really starting to think about what's appropriate, developmentally appropriate in terms of their understanding that adults should be sharing about their response and their reactions. They also might be starting to have some concern about how the adults are responding, and so perhaps keeping their responses quiet or at a minimum, or sharing it with different people because they don't want to overwhelm their carer or parent. And again, we've got that decreased attentional ability and perhaps some impact on their learning at this age group in that upper primary. And then we look at the adolescents as a group. We may have increased tension, irritability, and difficulty relaxing. So again, some of our curiosity might be, what's a developmentally appropriate irritable adolescent versus an irritable adolescent impacted by a disaster? There could be the ruptures in peer relationships. So again, if that irritability and perhaps avoidance and withdrawal, mood swings is impacting on their peer relationships. But also we might see that they don't want to admit that they're having any reactions. They just want to conform to the peer responses. I know echoing loudly for me when I read that is some adolescents at a high school where that I was supporting said, you adults just haven't got over it yet. We're all fine. You keep carrying on about this disaster. We knew from the data and from the increase in these things like the ruptured relationships and the tension and behavioural issues, that they weren't over it. They just didn't want it described as, you know, you've been impacted by this disaster. Again, the impact on learning through their minimal attention or decreased attention, but also just calling out for pre-adolescents and adolescents that what can increase is substance abuse and that acting out and rebellious behaviour. So you've seen this graph from David, and what I guess I just wanted to, I'm not going to get you to do in the chat in the interest of time, but just have a little moment of thinking for yourself. If we were looking at, for example, the delayed line, what would you think about children and adolescents? Why would they be on that delayed trajectory? And now I've asked you the curious question. One of the things I've already mentioned is perhaps they're holding it together as they see that their parents or carers are particularly distressed and they've just held it together enough, and then as perhaps they're feeling like they're okay, maybe mum and dad and the carer are you know, getting back into their routines, and then the child goes in the family system, right, now I can have my turn of dropping the bundle. But also just in terms of holding it together across time, it also can depend on things like they might have been in year 5 or 6 in school at the time of a disaster, and they've got teachers they know, friends they know, routines they know, and then they move into high school. And so we've just got, again, it's that dynamic and changeable over time that David was mentioning. It's like, what else is happening in the life of this young person that might mean they're at risk of maybe getting into the delayed response, or perhaps not recovering as quickly as we'd like them to. And I guess what we want to keep in mind for everybody, but my focus is for students, is thinking about, we're monitoring the ripples. So yes, the disaster's happened, but what are the ripples outwards, and how can, you know, can we minimize the impact of them? Can we minimize the impact of that trajectory also being negative? And an example of that I've given you across that sort of age range from early primary school right up to high school, that one of the impacts is that brain fog, the attentional issues, certainly comprehension and language production is always impacted. And if we're thinking of a young person or a child who's in, say, year 3, go, okay, for year 3, at the moment, it's term 2. Maybe across term 2, they're going to be a bit impacted. Their language is a bit, it's a bit regressed. They're not spelling as well. Perhaps they're not writing as well. They're not understanding instructions as well. We can probably ride a bit of a wave about that. But if we had that same sort of response, but the young person was in year 12 and they're just about to do their trial exams and they've got their HSC or, final year 12 exams imminent, we may respond much more quickly. We may put in really explicit responses about managing those attentional issues and maybe supporting their language. So it's really us thinking about and knowing the young people and thinking, what do they need right now to support them and minimise, as I said, any sort of complicating trajectories. So the Australian Psychological Society put together 3 things in terms of sort of monitoring, I guess, things that increase vulnerability. So the next 3 slides, we've got a couple of ideas about what we need to be alert to pre-disaster, then about the disaster exposure itself, and then post-disaster. So again, just highlighting a couple of these because you will get a copy of the slides. So if I don't cover every point, you'll have a chance to have a look at them. But I really wanted to call out the pre-existing stresses are things like living in out-of-home care, disability or complex needs for our young people who are living as carers for their family, and those with child protection concerns. We also have a group of young people who may feel that they don't have little support. We've echoed again through, I feel like I'm the third wave of the echo through Kris and David saying about how important connection is. So we have some young people who may, be going to school, but they don't feel particularly connected. They don't feel like they've got a social group. They're at a greater risk pre-disaster. And then we've got some of the family factors that we may know about in the community, but we may not. So parental substance abuse and mental health issues, parental lack of supervision, and parents with a higher anxiety. So again, David mentioned, trying to understand the history of the community. This is always also trying to understand some of the history of individuals or even groups of people. Because as you move into a community, you may not know, well, who are the individuals who are living in out-of-home care or have a disability? But it's about thinking, well, what we need to do is in our responses, we need to have a, flagged in our mind. We need to be thinking about what is our response for kids with a disability? What is our response for that small but important group of young people who are carers? And then at the time of the disaster, so some fairly obvious things like the loss, witnessing the event firsthand and experience of loss, the impact of the loss. Again, really starting to get into what was the child thinking at the time. So if they thought that they or someone they love was going to die or was going to be significantly injured, whether that was reality-based or not, that was their perception at the time. They are certainly at greater risk of developing some mental health issues, including PTSD. And then some other things like, were they evacuated, separated from parents? So, for example, I was working with some children in the flood recovery in Lismore in New South Wales, and I had some children who were on the roof while their carers or parent had gone to seek help, and they were at significantly more distress than those who may have been on a rooftop for longer but were there with a parent. Even if it was one parent, they felt safer and more connected, and some of them had their dogs and cats and all sorts of things on the roof. So, but they felt like this is a very extraordinary event, but they were there with their parent and had that sense of safety through that connection. The other thing is about the disruption to schooling if the school itself is damaged or impacted, and the family relocating. And I guess there are many things about the family relocating. Often we might just think, oh, that's a disruption to, say, the friendship circles or the teachers that you know. It also could be like extracurricular activities that the young person was involved in at one school that they're not able to be involved in at the new school. But the other thing is that as an education system and school system, so often if that school is in that disaster area, they are actually a focal point often in the community, especially in some of our rural and regional areas. And so a lot of support and resourcing comes into the community through the school. And if a family, because of needing to relocate for housing, moves out of the community where the disaster is impacted, again, that sense of isolation for that young person is like, well, I've been through this, for example, flood, and I'm now at school with people who don't understand anything about it. There's not really support for me or my family coming in via the school. It's all back where we used to live. So the third aspect here is, what about post-disaster? So some of the things that increase vulnerability for young people are more protective parenting. And if you can think back to what are some of the things I said about the adolescents, that, you know, if they increased irritability, they might be more risk-taking, and yet parents are being more protective. That can cause that tension. Again, through their own responses, or just the myriad of things that they are now responding to because of the disaster, they may be less available to the child. They may have mental health or substance abuse issues, and, as has been mentioned already, again, that increase in family and domestic violence. What we really need to think about with young people is that exposure through media, family discussions, and just really maintaining that extra support, particularly having regular attendance at school. And just that final point on this page is the enrolment in appropriate settings. So again, calling out children and young people with disabilities who may be enrolled in a specialist setting. And again, if they have to move to relocate for housing, or if there's been an impact on their school, they may not be getting the services and resources that they need. We have to wrap up, so I'm going to do this in 1 minute or less, I think. So what we do with young people is we don't rush in as an army of psychologists. We try to do this watchful waiting. We're monitoring for the signs of distress. If we know the typical responses, we go, right, we're alert to those. We're alert to vulnerable kids and the communities that communities of young people that may be vulnerable. We watch for that, and then it's an active strategy. We're looking out for changes in their behaviour and then knowing the supports. And I don't need to go into this tier because you've seen that through David, but I just wanted to call out for some of our young people, the types of things that you might have heard of in your work that sit into that targeted area are programs such as Stormbirds or Cool Kids or Seasons for Growth. So again, they're the sort of things that we might be referring young people to. And just a reminder again about that connection to school. School really does have that support for young people's well-being. It's predictable and safe. Usually there's that good relationship with at least another set of adults who can do that watchful waiting, the positive peer relationships, and just it's such a good way to provide that predictable, safe, supportive routine that we know is so important in terms of supporting recovery. The next two slides I'm not going to talk about at all because they are some 12 points for parents, how they could support their parents. I think they're fairly self-explanatory. And so I'll just finish with, it is really important when you're working with children or with anyone in this area to look after yourself. We remind this of parents all the time, that if they're feeling cared for and looking after their own well-being, they're much more able to respond to the needs of their children. We try and use the phrase, we want to engender a contagion of calm, not a contagion of chaos. Erin.
In about 30 seconds, I'm just going to say thank you so much for Kris Rose and David, for your presentations today. Thanks to the people who've put questions in the chat. We've unfortunately run out of time for today, but we will take those questions and build them into next month's webinar. Thanks so much to our speakers and Ada, and for all of the people on the line today for coming and hanging with us for an hour and a half. We've heard about moving at the speed of trust, the importance of connection, the importance of taking time out, investing in your relationships with the people you love, care about, having a bit of fun, working in a strengths-based way, and watchful waiting, and creating, I'm not going to get it right, but I love what you said at the end there, Rose, around
Contagion of calm.
Contagion of calm, not a contagion of chaos. So thank you all. Thank you for everything you're doing, supporting communities, and take care of yourselves and those around you. Thank you.